Jimmy, who is a Nigerian and of course an expert when it comes to research. So I think Mr. Jimmy, I don't know if you can take over now.
Yes, true. I can now take over. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you
Sorry
for
to
joining this.
interject. Sorry to interject. Please, the host, I just have a small submission. Those who are not, the person who is not, people who are not presenting, please could you kindly tell them to mute their mic so that we can all focus and be able to concentrate on the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so what Mr. Zika just said, if to prevent any background noise, we should all try and put our mic off unless along the way or after the presentation, there's room for questions and you can put on your mics and you'll be given the platform to ask your question. But as Mr. Dimbi is presenting, we are all advised to kindly put off our mics to prevent any background noise. Thank you. So I think Mr. Dimbi, you can proceed now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, and for making this wonderful session. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the network issues. I had some network issues. That is why I'm not hearing you very well, but thank you so much. Now I'm back. More specifically, yeah, just want to actually thank those people, especially from the East African region. I know it's a bit late for them, but I just appreciate their presence now. Thank you so much. Okay. My name is Jimmy Nkaiwuatei. I'm a student, final year student at Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Kenya, as moderator has introduced me. And I am AMR enthusiast and I'm a researcher at Students Against Superbugs Africa. And I am the head of drug research, discovery and innovations program. Yeah, I've been engaging some research on drug research and development as well as in antimicrobial resistance. So maybe yeah, I've been in research for approximately a year now, yeah, or less. So I think we can begin. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, thank you so much. Today we are talking about the basics of research, and to begin with, when we can define about what is research. Specifically, research is a systematic way of problem solving. It can also be simply defined as a systematic process of looking for solutions for problems. We can say it is systematic because it has to follow a certain process, at a certain procedure, and certain logical steps to achieve a certain problem. So basically, we can say that research is that a systematic process or logical way of finding solution to certain problems. Yeah, by following some logical and procedural ways. Next slide, please. Okay, when we talk about the characteristics of a good research, the first thing we can talk of, it must be systematic. This means it has to follow a certain procedure and a process. So that's why it has to follow some logical steps to achieve its objective. Secondly, we can also say that it must be logical, or it should be logical. Yeah, either maybe we can say that in form of it can be inductive or deductive approach. That is a reasonable approach to research. When you talk about inductive research, let's say, for example, yeah, we are coming maybe from an observation, and maybe, for example, you identify a certain maybe observation from your research. Now, from that point of view, maybe, for example, you do or research on a certain, maybe, for example, a certain topic. After maybe, for example, coming up with an observation, you go and generalize information of a certain population. Maybe, for example, in a certain sample in a population, you find some observation. Now, the inductive process. Okay, oh, sorry, okay. Oh, it's okay then. Or maybe, yeah, when you talk about the research process, it begins actually, maybe, for example, you have already selected maybe your research topic. You go maybe to the literature review, you do maybe conclusion from the literature review, what you find from the literature review, the important information, related to your literature review. Maybe to go to formulate a research question. After formulating a research question, we select an appropriate research design. The research design will help you, especially when attaining an objective for your research question. The next step, you can collect relevant data. That is, after, for example, taking your research experiment, whether it's experimental or maybe observation. I think someone is muted. Someone's talking. Okay, so it's okay. When you talk about the process of research writing, actually it can begin from the selection of the research topic. And this one, maybe, for example, you have an interest in a certain field, you select a topic, maybe, for example, you see that you are capable of doing, or you are interested in that. So that is the first step. Secondly, when you go to literature review, in literature review, maybe, for example, after identifying your research topic or maybe the topic of interest, you go to the literature and actually do a study, data research on your literature review, looking for certain information or maybe relevant publication that are related to your topic of interest. Thirdly, we can develop a research question. Maybe after identifying a topic of interest, your research topic, you can go to develop a research question. Maybe, for example, it must be also able to answer your research topic, and also it must be aligned to the objectives of your research topic. We can also to formulate the research hypothesis. Yeah, an hypothesis, maybe, for example, you have you want to undertake a certain maybe experimental approach on a certain thing. You can develop either the alternative hypothesis or the null hypothesis. You want to prove maybe whether, for example, a certain thing is true or false. So that is the research hypothesis. Then we could go to define the research objectives. Maybe, yeah, the objectives always, they need to be very smart. Yeah, select the appropriate research methods. Yeah, in selecting your methods, this is very important. For example, to achieve your objectives, you need to be selective on the appropriate method that you are going to use in actually achieving your results. And lastly, we can go to selection of maybe, for example, the best data analysis tool. After collecting your data, you have done your experiment, you've done your research. Now you want to analyze your data, actually to come up with a conclusion, or maybe, for example, for interpretation purposes. And to begin with, maybe, for example, the research topic, you are select maybe if when selecting your research topic or the research topic of interest, actually you need to consider maybe, for example, the area of interest. Which area are you so much interested in? That is a first point you need to consider when coming up with a topic of the research topic. We can also look at the literature. You study widely so much that can really help you in deriving a research topic. Maybe, for example, you want to study maybe about drug development or maybe antimicrobial resistance or maybe, for example, any other topic. So literature really help you to come up with a research topic. By reading it widely, you'll be able to get enough information very widely that will help you to come up with a narrow specific and a narrow and a specific objective. Another thing we can talk about, maybe, for example, you can start with a broader approach of the research topic. Now, after selecting maybe a broad topic, you can split down into a very simplified form, very precise, very clear, and really help you to achieve the objectives. You know, in every research, the topic of that research, actually, you'll be able to achieve your results. You should be able to attain these objectives. And one of the best way to do so, actually, to simplify your research topic to be very simple and clear. That is very important. Next slide, please. Okay, when considering the literature review, actually, that's the most important area as a researcher to consider. You don't just need to go to maybe, for example, every source of information. You need to be very selective on the type of the literature that you're going to read to your specific topic of interest or your topic of research. And this usually literature review very relevant. It should be very relevant to your topic. You don't have to maybe, for example, read on maybe consider some other topics that are not relevant to your topic of study. They may not be more specific to your particular topic of research, but actually they should be relevant and close to the topic of interest. And usually it is recommended that the primary sources of information should be used and actually in citation, in drawing and every information in the literature review. The primary source of information, maybe you can so-called the initial source of information. Maybe, for example, let's say, for example, if you see maybe, for example, citations, maybe the principle, maybe, for example, the initial source of that information, it is very important that actually you could cite the initial source of the information rather than the secondary sources of such information. Another thing is that usually very important and to use the latest sources of information, maybe to a particular topic that you are studying in. Maybe, for example, when we talk about antimicrobial resistance, we can see that maybe, for example, there's a lot of research that has been undertaken recently here in 2022. There's a lot of, maybe, for example, from the grant paper that was just released early this year, it is very much important. Maybe, for example, you don't have maybe to cite some other information that were done in the 20 years ago or maybe 10 years ago. So relevant to the topic and latest source of information is very important. Okay, then maybe when coming up with a research question, this is another very important area that you need to consider, because as you want to achieve your objectives, you need actually to align your research topic to the objectives. Maybe what objectives are you going to achieve in your research? So the research question will really help you to achieve your objectives. So when when drawing up your or formulating your research question, you need to align your research questions to the objectives and also to the topic. They should be focused. Okay, that should be very clear and focused to objectives. At the same time, the research question should be answerable. It should not be too difficult to answer. Maybe, for example, you can maybe define a question that could be complex and not understandable to achieve. So it is so much important to come up with a question that is so much simplified and easily attainable, easily answerable. Yeah, something like that. For example, you can say, what is the major risk factor attributing to neonatal sepsis in Lakewood Medical Center? When you see that research question, it is simple and clear. Actually, one can see that you want to achieve a certain objective in a certain area in a particular time, maybe, for example, in a particular, maybe age group or maybe a target group. So that's the focus of a research question. When formulating a research hypothesis, it's also very important, as you know, that you need to consider both the alternative hypothesis and the null hypothesis, and both must be testable and falsifiable. Actually, you need to come up with a way that you are able to test the truth part of the seed and also the false side of your research hypothesis. Maybe you're coming up with the objectives. Are you able to define and deduce that the observation that you make are either true to your observation? Maybe do they align maybe to your assumption or your hypothesis? Or maybe, for example, how far are they from your, maybe, for example, from your assumptions? So coming up with a research hypothesis is very important. And maybe, for example, this could help you to come up and identify, maybe, for example, how far your topic or your objectives are far from your interest, or maybe, for example, your objectives. Yeah, it should also define the problem and the objectives. Yeah, as I have said, the research hypothesis should actually align to the topic that you're studying and also to the objectives. For example, maybe, for example, you can say the alternative hypothesis, the E. coli is resistant to ciprofloxacin. And maybe, for example, when coming up to the alternative hypothesis, E. coli is not resistant to ciprofloxacin. Maybe, for example, you're studying about, maybe, for example, how E. coli is resistant to ciprofloxacin. So this really, according to your observation, you'll be able to come up, maybe, for example, with a conclusion that maybe either E. coli is resistant to ciprofloxacin or E. coli is not resistant to ciprofloxacin. So after your observation, you'll be able to come up with the conclusion that maybe, for example, this research is based on this observation, and the guiding principle, one of the most important guiding steps is the research hypothesis. And most of the time, the research hypothesis, it can also be a source of research topics for other researchers. Maybe somebody come up that maybe identify your topic that you found that E. coli is resistant to ciprofloxacin. At the same time, I can be able to go and maybe reproduce the results, maybe try to look at maybe, for example, which approach did you use to identify maybe, for example, or how resistant is H. pylori to ciprofloxacin. At the same time, I need also to consider that maybe, for example, we're able to produce the same results. Okay. In research, maybe, for example, the objectives. These are the key principles that are in every research. These are the clear guidelines that every research should follow when coming up with the research objectives. The first should be very specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. When you talk about these, the principles of an objective and a clear objective in research, actually, every project should come up, maybe, for example, with the research topic. The objective should be very clear and understandable, very simple to understand, measurable. You'll be able to attain those, maybe, for example, the objectives, and also attainable. Yeah, it should be measurable and attainable, realistic and logistic, and also time bound. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, maybe for some, when you talk about the process of selecting a research methodology, there's some important approaches and methods and maybe ways you need to consider and principles you need to consider when coming up with a research methodology. And the first thing is the research goal. Maybe what are your objectives? What do you want to achieve in your research? What maybe, for example, you intended to achieve? And one of the things that could really help you is the objective. Maybe, for example, when selecting the method of interest, you need also to consider, okay, will this help me to achieve the objectives that I want to do? Or maybe, for example, will deviate from my objectives. So that's very key in identifying a research methodology that maybe, for example, will really help you to achieve your objectives. Or maybe to what extent, maybe, for example, your method could be able to provide enough information to your objectives. Is it so much efficient? Maybe is it reliable? Maybe, for example, how accurate is the method? Maybe in aligned to your research goal and objectives. It should also be efficient and reliable. Maybe, for example, a method, maybe, for example, reliable. Maybe for every researcher maybe should be very selective in coming up with an efficient method to achieve his results. Otherwise, this could be very difficult, maybe, for example, to achieve your results. Maybe, for example, if the method could be not efficient to maybe particular research or the research topic or every experiment that you're undertaking, you will not be able to achieve your intended objectives. Another thing is cost, very important to consider for every research that you want to undertake. Some methods maybe could be so much expensive to achieve, and this really could interfere or maybe could hinder you from achieving what you want. Maybe at a point you need to actually forego some other steps so that maybe, for example, to reduce the expenditure that is involved in a particular method. So maybe, for example, you could rather go for a cheaper method but actually incorporate every aspect of it than maybe, for example, going for a method that could be very expensive and skip some important, maybe, for example, requirements or necessities for that project, so that maybe, for example, you reduce the cost involved in it. So cost is also another very important aspect to consider when coming up with the research method. Another thing is time. Maybe, for example, will the method, maybe, for example, that you're going to achieve will be able to give you the objective within a time frame. Maybe, for example, you wanted to study, maybe, for example, you undertake your project for 2 months, maybe, and the method you have, maybe, for example, could maybe, for example, provide results after 3 months or even more. So automatically you're going to undergo some methods that could really not give you quick information about your research. Okay. when coming up with a data analysis tool, this is very important because actually in coming up with the interpretation of analysis is very important. And maybe after getting observations, your results, you need to analyze. So maybe for someone into forms that could be really understandable to maybe to your target audience, or maybe to every other researcher, or maybe for example, yeah, to anyone, or even to yourself. And data analysis is very important because this will really help you to interpret that information that you got, and really help you maybe for example, and clearly come up with things that maybe for example you did not achieve in your experiment. And one of the things that you need to consider is your objectives. Maybe for example, if you choose a method that really assist you in data analysis, will it be able to give you maybe enough information concerning your objectives? Or maybe for example, also the research question that is very important also in helping you in choosing the best analysis tool to use in your data. And also the research design, maybe for example, whether it will be quantitative or qualitative, it depends on maybe for example, on the kind of objective that you wanted to achieve. And also the research design, the question and objectives. These are the key things that really help you in coming up with the best research analysis tool. Maybe the complexity of the data also will really help you. Thank you. When you talk about types of research, there's quite important things we can talk about here. And for example, the applied part of it, that is applied research. And this usually it is seek to find solutions to practical problems. And these, for example, these are the challenges that usually affect us day in, day out. So actually, this information or a type of research intend to provide maybe solutions, and also maybe, for example, more understanding on particular problems that are affecting us in everyday life. It is used to find solution to everyday problems. Maybe, for example, you can say how to increase the access to quality medicines in Africa. And this is a good example, maybe access to quality medicines, maybe it has been a challenge to Africa. So maybe, for example, you want to come up maybe with a way to identify maybe the appropriate method and good way to actually to increase access or improve access to quality medicines in Africa. Yes, next slide, please. Okay, we can also talk about basic research, and this involves research done to expand our knowledge on a particular topic rather than innovating or inventing something. So it is just a basic knowledge, just to provide a basic information and understanding on a particular topic. Maybe, for example, you knew that this is a problem, and maybe, for example, it is occurring this way. So this sometimes it tends to go deeper into understanding maybe how this problem is occurring, or maybe how something is happening. So that is just basic research. You're not intending to maybe identify something new from that field. You already know that this is a problem, and maybe, for example, this is how the problem need to be understood. So it's your role maybe to conduct maybe the particular role and function of basic research. It's just to provide important information on maybe, for example, how to clearly understand how a certain problem is occurring, or maybe, for example, to what extent is occurring, and maybe to whom it is occurring. Yes, thank you. Correlation research, we can say that it refers to a systematic study to determine the relationship between two or more variables without necessarily determining the cause and effect. This is actually just to determine the relationship, how two factors relate to each other, maybe how factor 1 and factor 2 relate to each other. This is very important, and maybe, for example, in trying to understand maybe two principles in maybe, for example, in research, how two things, maybe things that coexist together. You need maybe to understand how these things are affecting each other, or maybe, for example, how one thing affects another, or how these things relate together. Is it a mutual relationship? Is it one thing that maybe, for example, will help the existence of another thing? And maybe, for example, we can say that what is the relationship between effectiveness and potency of lead compound X? So maybe, for example, if you want to maybe, for example, increase the effectiveness of a certain drug, how maybe, for example, with this, how will you maybe, for example, or maybe adjust the potency of that drug. Maybe how potency and effectiveness of that drug. Is it maybe, for example, to a high effectiveness, and maybe is it directly proportional to potency, or maybe directly proportional? So your research actually targets to understand the relationship between these two key important factors, actually, and understanding maybe, for example, how two things relate to each other. Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, explanatory research, actually, this is almost similar. We can say that it's almost similar to correlation research, but here maybe, for example, it seeks to find the cause and effect based on observation. Maybe, for example, you find that something, maybe a drug has its effects. Maybe, for example, this is a potency of this antibiotic, and maybe, for example, how the potency, maybe, for example, will affect in turn the effectiveness of that drug. For example, what is the impact of potency of the effectiveness on the effectiveness of lead compound X? So maybe, for example, yeah, when I increase, maybe, for example, maybe the higher the potency of this drug, the higher the effectiveness, or maybe the lower the potency of a certain drug, the lower the effectiveness. So this explanatory research, it just intends to maybe to deep into maybe understanding how one factor actually affect another factor. These factors, maybe, for example, usually correlate together. So that is a main role of maybe explanatory research. Just try to give more information on maybe how one thing could impact to another, or maybe, for example, one thing could result to the maybe existence or non-existence or reduction or even increase of another thing. Yeah, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, when we come to research reasoning, as I had mentioned, we can talk about deductive reasoning. It applies mostly in quantitative research. Maybe, for example, gram-positive bacteria contain a weak cell wall. In deductive reasoning, that is maybe, for example, it involves a lot of generalization. Deductive reasoning and research, you come up maybe, for example, with a research idea. After maybe, for example, you do a lot of literature, you find maybe most of the information contain information that gram-positive bacteria contain a weak cell wall. So maybe, for example, after getting so many relevant sources of information, and each one is talking about maybe, for example, the gram-positive bacteria do contain a weak cell wall. So this is maybe, for example, it is too general, because the gram-positive bacteria, we cannot say that it is a particular bacteria. This is a group of many bacteria. So it is not just one bacterium. So it is a group of so many bacteria. So it is just generalized that this is a distinct characteristics in the gram-positive bacteria, that they contain a thick cell wall. So we can think of maybe, for example, from the literature, there's a lot of theory on this, maybe, for example, relating to your topic of interest of the particular topic that you had selected to study. And maybe, for example, after reading the literature review, after reviewing the literature, you come up with an hypothesis. Oh, so this is maybe true. Okay, maybe, for example, the gram-positive bacteria, they contain the thick cell wall. Okay, maybe, for example, develop an hypothesis. This could be true or this could be false. So you need to undertake a research, maybe to actually to ascertain the assumption that the gram-positive bacteria, maybe, for example, how did they come up, maybe, for example, to realize that the gram-positive bacteria really contain the thick cell wall, maybe to what extent, maybe, for example, how thick it is, or maybe, for example, you need to measure maybe the thickness in maybe how many nanometers, could be 20, it could be 40, it could be 100 or even more. So you need actually to ascertain maybe how thick maybe the thick cell wall as compared to other type of bacteria, the gram-negative. So that is very important that is deductive reasoning. And maybe, for example, after that, maybe the previous one, please. We can go back. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe, for example, okay, yeah, in deductive reasoning, maybe I just wanted to finish up on this. Yeah, maybe, for example, you undertake here and find the observation that this is the observation that maybe, for example, it is related to the literature that I read in previous maybe times. Maybe, for example, you'll be able to confirm after carrying out your experiment, you wanted to confirm that true, this is the gram-positive bacteria containing thick cell wall. You observe that this is actually the true of the results. This is the truth of the results. You'll be able to confirm that actually this is how it is. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Okay, in inductive reasoning, this applies in qualitative research, and it seems to be somehow specific to a topic of interest. A reasoning that it is specific, it wants to be so much specific. It does not generalize the things, maybe for example, the action of math. It does not incorporate some aspect of generality. And maybe we can say it incorporates some aspects of reductionism in as opposed to reductive research. For example, we can say Staphylococcus aureus contains a thick cellule, as opposed to maybe the deductive bacteria. This is so much specific because it is actually the Staphylococcus aureus that contain the thick cellule. So maybe, for example, that is according to experiment that you undertook and you found that Staphylococcus aureus contain thick cellule. So that is the observation that you took. So it is so much specific to this particular bacterium. So that is the inductive reasoning that you have. So maybe, for example, after maybe doing a series of experiments of so many bacteria, maybe for example in the same gene and the gram in the same gene, maybe for example the gram positive bacteria, how many maybe for example did you study, and you found that all bacterium under your study actually they contain cellule. So you're able to identify a certain pattern, a certain specific bacteria, they share certain characteristics. So okay, so you're able to identify that this is the pattern of maybe, for example, a pattern of observations. You observe that this bacteria contain this type of the cellule. So you're able to identify that in a certain group of bacteria, that is the gram-positive bacteria, there is a thick cellule. So maybe after carrying out several experiments, that is observation, and realize that actually this is the pattern of it. And maybe you're able to identify the hypothesis of the same. So maybe, for example, going back to a deductive theory, it goes back to the deductive theory. You develop a theory that all the gram-positive bacteria, they contain a gram-positive cellule. So when we try to compare the deductive reasoning and in inductive reasoning, we said that inductive reasoning in research is very specific, and as opposed to the deductive reasoning, which seems to be so much general. It include maybe, for example, there's a particular characteristics of organism in a certain population, and these organisms, they share particular characteristics. So you see that in a population, you are able to identify that these organisms, all the organisms in this population, they share a certain type of, maybe for example, a certain maybe a certain characteristic, a particular characteristic that is common among all these organisms in a population, or all the members of the population. So that is it is a general view, it's a general view, it's a general suggestion, it's a general observation. So after that is we can say that that is deductive, because it generalizes that all members in a particular all members in a population, they share these particular characteristics, as opposed to inductive. Inductive, you come now to be specific, to be clear, you narrow down to be able, for example, identify a certain member in that population. You said that in that population, this member has these particular characteristics. Now, maybe after undertaking a series of experiments and to ascertain maybe observation, you find that actually all members maybe of that population, they share these particular characteristics. Yeah, thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, when we try to look about the methods of conducting research, there could be so many methods of conducting research, including surveys, experiments, observations, and interviews. And when we say, we talk about the surveys, it could be a baseline survey, an interline survey, and maybe, or even a structured questionnaires. You come up with a questionnaire containing some information. You want to target a certain, and this usually it is not experimental. And maybe, yeah, they normally take a short time. Because maybe, for example, you can even contact within a few hours or even minutes, just collecting maybe opinions of maybe of people on a certain topic. You want to know maybe how informed, maybe for example, you wanted to study maybe the knowledge on a particular topic, the attitudes, or maybe, for example, practices, or of maybe, for example, antimicrobial resistance of a certain, or maybe among the students. So you just conduct a simple survey. So maybe, for example, a baseline survey, just only to understand how these people have knowledge on a particular topic. Maybe, for example, after that, you ascertain the level of knowledge of those people. You maybe, for example, maybe you just wanted to give maybe information, maybe a training on a particular, to inform these people on maybe a particular topic of interest. You wanted to teach them, maybe, for example, about antimicrobial resistance. So maybe after that, maybe you realize that these people actually have learned something on antimicrobial resistance. These people have learned something from the topic they had administered. So maybe after that, you also need to conduct a baseline survey to maybe, for example, to deduce how much maybe these people have learned, maybe what concepts of maybe of antimicrobial resistance have these people learned at the end, maybe at the end of this session. Maybe, for example, even after this session, maybe, for example, you conduct maybe for some